Operation Absolute Resolve began on January 3rd at approximately 2 a.m. local time. The opening move was a US cyber attack on Venezuela's energy infrastructure, plunging the entire capital, Caracas, into a blackout. Moments later, American air power moved in, systematically dismantling Venezuela's air defense systems and clearing a corridor for MH-60 helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, carrying operators from the elite Delta Force. The helicopters touched down inside the heavily guarded Fuerte Tuna military complex in southern Caracas. US planners were confident that Maduro was spending the night there, and they were right. Despite resistance encountered within the compound, 1 helicopter damaged and 6 operators wounded, within minutes American forces had Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, in custody. By approximately 4:29 a.m. local time, Maduro was already aboard the USS Iwo Jima, which transported him to the US naval base at Guantanamo. From there, he was flown to New York, where later that afternoon he was formally charged, among other offenses, with leading the narcotics organization, known as the Cartel de los Soles. Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolás Maduro to justice. With these words, President Trump summarized Operation Absolute Resolve. As he spoke, the aircraft carrying Maduro was already en route to New York, where just hours later he was formally charged, among other things, with running a narcotics cartel. Trump framed the abduction of Maduro as a model for the policy his administration intends to pursue across the Western Hemisphere. Drawing explicitly on the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, Trump seeks to eliminate all foreign influence from the Americas, along with leaders he deems hostile to the United States. Speaking to reporters, Trump suggested that Maduro's removal was only a prelude to broader changes in the region. In his vision, the United States is to assume the role once articulated by President Theodore Roosevelt, that of a gendarme wielding a big stick. According to the president's own warnings, that stick may soon be directed at Cuba, Colombia, or the drug cartels operating out of Mexico. In the past few years, it feels like the world has started moving faster than ever. Events that once took decades now unfold in weeks, and a single political shift, new technology, or regional crisis can reshape entire markets. In such times, understanding how global changes translate into economic reality becomes more important than ever. That is why I use XTB, an investment app that helps me follow and interpret those shifts through the lens of global markets. It has become my everyday tool for managing investments and tracking world trends. With access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs and commission-free investing up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover, it lets me act when new opportunities emerge, not after they have already passed.
In addition, XTB has prepared a free report for 2026, showing how geopolitics may affect the markets. Just download it from the link in the description and see what predictions you can translate into real investment decisions.
Remember that investing always involves risk. Trump presents Operation Absolute Resolve as the first concrete implementation of the new national security strategy published by his administration in early December last year. While much of the media reduced the document to a simple claim that America is retreating and stepping back from its role as the world's policeman, that retreat does not apply to the Western Hemisphere. Here, Trump has no intention of taking off the police uniform. On the contrary, following the example of President Theodore Roosevelt, he intends to arm himself with a big stick. The new strategy unveiled by Trump draws heavily on the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, Originally, the doctrine was meant to prevent European colonial powers from interfering in Latin America. Over time, however, it evolved into a justification for American hegemony in the region. Trump is now proposing a revival and a radicalization of this approach, one that analysts in Washington have dubbed the Monroe Doctrine. In essence, Trump is calling for full US hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. This is no longer merely about deterring external powers, such as China or Russia. It is about asserting America's unilateral right to eliminate actors that Washington deems hostile. If the US administration follows through on a full implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, and that is precisely what Trump's own statements, as well as those of his closest advisors, suggest, then Maduro's removal is only the beginning. Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, or Colombia could be next. Yet before Trump selects his next target, he must first finish the game in Venezuela. Trump has revealed very little about how he envisions Venezuela's future in the post-Maduro era, or what a credible process of democratization might look like. Yet these questions are critical. Although Nicolas Maduro has been abducted, his closest allies remain firmly in control in Caracas, and there is little indication that this will change anytime soon. Trump rejected a proposal floated by parts of his own administration that Venezuela should be led during a transitional period by Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the democratic opposition and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Speaking bluntly to reporters, Trump said Machado was too weak and lacked real support inside the country. At the same time, Trump disclosed that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had held talks with Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who allegedly promised Rubio that she would, quote, do whatever the US needs. Trump hinted that he could accept Rodriguez as Venezuela's new leader, at least on a temporary basis. This immediately sparked speculation about the extent of cooperation between Rodriguez and Washington, and in particular whether she was aware in advance of the US plan to abduct Nicolas Maduro. Those suspicions were reinforced by US officials themselves, who admitted that the operation was facilitated by the presence of an American asset within Maduro's inner circle. Officially, Rodriguez has denied these allegations. Just hours after the US operation, she convened Venezuela's National Security Council in a session broadcast live on state television. She declared that Maduro had been kidnapped and that he remains the country's legitimate president. Marco Rubio responded coolly and with visible distance, implying, without saying so outright, that Rodriguez's remarks were intended primarily for a domestic audience. It is difficult to draw firm conclusions from these competing signals. One fact, however, stands out. The National Security Council meeting was attended by the entire Venezuelan power elite, including Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, National Assembly Speaker Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy Rodriguez's brother, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, and General Domingo Hernandez Lares, head of the Armed Forces Strategic Command. It is therefore reasonable to assume that if, and this is worth emphasizing, if there is indeed some form of cooperation between Rodriguez and the United States, it is likely taking place with the knowledge and consent of Venezuela's entire ruling elite, which in this case appears to be presenting a unified front. One issue that has set commentators ablaze, and one for which President Trump has offered few concrete answers, is Venezuela's oil. Venezuela does indeed hold the world's largest proven oil reserves, but between 80 and 90% of them consist of ultra-heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, thick, difficult to extract, and dependent on imported light diluents, as well as a stable power grid, something the country in its current state simply does not have. As a result, Venezuela's oil sector is only a shadow of its former self. Production has collapsed from a historic peak of 3 million barrels per day to roughly 900,000 barrels today. Trump has declared that he wants to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry, and that this reconstruction should involve American companies investing billions of dollars in the country. Meanwhile, analysts at Rystad Energy estimate that restoring production to 3 million barrels per day would require roughly $110 billion in investment. And that figure covers upstream exploration and production alone. It is a staggering sum, roughly equivalent to what all US oil majors invested globally in 2024 combined. The challenge is compounded by the fact that Venezuelan output cannot be ramped up quickly. Even under optimistic assumptions, reaching 3 million barrels per day would take close to 9 years. As a result, American companies are unlikely to rush into rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector, especially since giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips have already been burned once before. Their assets in Venezuela were nationalized under the government of Hugo Chavez. The best positioned company today is in fact Chevron, which already operates in Venezuela under a special license and accounts for roughly 20% of the country's current production. Chevron has the necessary infrastructure and could scale up its investments, leading to a modest increase in output, though certainly not the kind of boom President Trump appears to be hoping for. Even if Venezuela's oil production cannot be significantly expanded, those reserves still carry major geopolitical weight. US control over Venezuelan oil would block the expansion of Chinese companies in the region, and perhaps more importantly, increase pressure on Cuba, which imports around 30,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, covering roughly 25% of its energy needs. There is growing evidence that the collapse of Cuba's communist regime sits high on Trump's list of priorities for a second term. Operation Absolute Resolve was a spectacular tactical success, but a profound strategic unknown. History teaches us that removing a dictator is usually the easiest part. The real challenge comes right after. For now, the situation is at best chaotic. The old ruling elite, led by Delcy Rodriguez, still holds power in Caracas, while the Trump administration appears to treat her cooperation as a given. The White House is already looking beyond Venezuela, toward new targets and the broader application of the so-called Monroe Doctrine, and there is no shortage of enemies. Cuba now finds itself in an especially precarious position. For years, American analysts have argued that the road to the fall of the government in Havana runs through Caracas. With Maduro removed from the board, pressure on Cuba will only intensify. All the more so because Operation Absolute Resolve has significantly elevated the political standing of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for whom, as the son of Cuban immigrants, the liberation of Havana from communist rule carries deep personal meaning. Rubio has made little effort to hide that Cuba could be next. At a press conference, he put it bluntly, quote, "Look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I would be concerned, at least, a little bit," unquote. And so, after Venezuela, Cuba is almost certainly the next US priority. The Trump administration appears to view Havana as a relatively easy target, but the list of adversaries against whom the White House may seek to apply the Monroe Doctrine does not end there. Mexican and Colombian drug cartels are next, followed by Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. Although Trump insists that America should no longer act as the world's policeman, and is scaling back US commitments in other regions, this constraint does not apply to the Western Hemisphere. Here, Trump is pursuing total US supremacy, even if that supremacy must be imposed by brute force. Because the attack on Venezuela reveals something deeper. As Thomas Friedman once wrote, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 simply because it could. The same logic applies today. Trump ordered the abduction of Maduro simply because he could. Is Trump violating international law? Yes, indeed. Just as Ronald Reagan did in Grenada in 1983, and George H.W. Bush did in Panama in 1989. And just like Reagan and Bush before him, Trump will face no real consequences. A world governed by the law of the strong is once again becoming the default setting. The United Nations has grown dysfunctional, and the United States no longer seeks to enforce international law. Instead, like China and Russia, it is actively undermining its foundations. Over time, this trend will only accelerate, and international law, or what remains of it, will be enforced exclusively against the weak. And this leaves us with one final question. As the year begins, so shall the year unfold?